Who remembers CCT?
Yeah! Best timer ever! Me too!
It's a good timer. Actually, I want to just... it's a timer. I'll mention it later. Actually, the other question I wanted to ask is, who knows what Noodle is? Okay. Who doesn't know what Noodle is? Okay. So Scrambles in the WCA have had a long and a controversial history. So I don't have time to talk about everything, but I'll sort of talk about how we got to Noodle, and I won't have so much time to go into what, let's say, how do they work for Scrambles, but I'll go over a lot of the why do they work and why are they the way they are, because a lot of it is not obvious and a lot of it took a long time. And some of it is not very widely known, because either we were around in 2004 or 2008, or you weren't, and then you never saw the speed-solving Rubik's Cube forum posts or things like that where this happened. So I think everyone here will learn something new. Okay. So the main point of my story today is how we got from this, which is blurry, and focusing is not going to help very much. This was the regulations in 2004 for Scrambles, and this is what they are now. My point is, we now have a lot more details, and that's what I'm going to cover. There's basically one theme, and if there's one thing I wanted to take away from today and remember, is that we used to just do random moves for Scrambles. Whenever you wanted your puzzle in a random state, you would do some random moves, or you would get a computer to come up with random moves for you, and then you hope that if you do enough random moves, this will be a good random state. But nowadays we know better, and we can generate random state scrambles. A lot of you are already using these if you're using computer timers, but it took us a long time to get here. So roughly what I'm going to go over is that distinction that I mentioned between random moves and random state, and then why random moves are not good, which is not obvious, and it doesn't always apply to all puzzles. And then history of the WCA Scrambles and where we ended up with our current regulations. This is what the WCA Scramble program looked like in 2004. Has anybody used this? Okay, a few. You can still get it from the WCA website. You go to regulations and then hold over the menu to history and look at 2004. And there are links to the old Scramble programs. And you used to enter the number of sides on your puzzle, the number of scrambles you wanted, how long you wanted it to be, which was default 25 for 3x3 cubes, and press Scramble. And the browser would just generate some number of random moves and show you the output, and this is what we use for competitions. So it kind of still looks the same, but the interface at the top is old. And this is the state of the art for... Stature remembers this. This is the state of the art before CCT for timers at home. If you were cubing at home, you were using JNetCube. It was hosted in a site called strangepuzzle.com by a guy named Chris Hunt, who's actually from Portland, but he's not in town today. Anyhow, that was also 25 random moves and had lots of other features, some of which you don't use anymore, but it didn't have random state scrambles. CCT also didn't. CCT came along in 2007. I don't think I have a screenshot, though. Anyhow, I want to explain why random moves are not good, and there's one good example that hopefully will be convincing. If you know about Stefan Pachmann, he was once, I think, world record holder for Megaminx. He's done a lot of sort of technical posts on the speedsolving.com forum, and he's still around sometimes. And he wrote a program that analyzed 3x3 random state scramblers like the one that I just showed from the WCA and JNetCube. And he looked at what happened if you did 25 random moves, how the edge orientation would look. And it turns out, if you look at the edge orientation, the probability of 0 flipped edges was 0.0013, and the probability of all 12 flipped edges, according to the standard definition for either ZZ or 3-0 blindfolded, was 0.0004. And if you look at those numbers, the chance of getting all your edges oriented is 3 times what it should be, which is quite a lot, because the 0.0004, which is what it should be, is 1 out of 2048, and 3 times as much is an extra about a little bit more than 1 out of 1,000 times you're getting all edges oriented when you shouldn't be. And back in the day, people were using 3OP for blindfolded. These days, people use ZC. And there are a lot of scrambles in competition. There are way more than 1,000 per year. So there's a good chance that if you use scrambles with random moves, somebody will be getting an edge-oriented scramble that they get unfairly, that they wouldn't have otherwise gotten. And they will get it and someone else won't get it, so they get a better chance to set a record with their method. So they get an unfair advantage just because we didn't generate our scrambles properly. I think one of the first few Caltech competitions actually had edges all oriented for blindfolded, and everyone used 3OP, orient edges in the corners and then solve them, and they just got a skip. And so there's a pretty good chance, more likely than not, that this happened unfairly because of the way they were generating scrambles. So 1 out of 1,000 may still not sound a lot to you, but this is just edge orientation. If you look at corners, or if you look at edges and corners combined, things get a lot worse. If you know about group theory, what you can do is roughly look at edge and corner orientation and where the middle layer edge pieces go, and it turns out that even 100 moves is not really that random from a mathematical perspective. So let's say just for cubing, we don't need perfect mathematical cubing. How many moves is enough for random state for competitions or practicing at home? Is it 50? Is it 100? I think this is the wrong question. This is like asking how many solves do you need to do on a Rubik's brand cube until it turns well enough. You can do as many as you want, but it's the wrong approach. And people have a better approach. In the case of cubes, brands from China like Moyu have come up with really good cubes, and you just use that instead. And here, you can talk a long time about what is random enough, but we have a better approach, which is random state scrambles, which just completely gets rid of the issue. And the idea is fairly simple, which is that you want a random state of the puzzle, and you generate that state. So you're like, well, here's a state I want. A computer might generate it, or if you really wanted to, you could like sit down with a pencil and paper, and you're like, all right, I want, you roll some dice. I want yellow-green here, and it's up to you how you generate it. And then if you have a program that can solve it, you take the solution, run it backwards, and then you can take a solved cube and get yourself the scramble, the random state. So it's not obvious, but there are a bunch of other pretty good approaches that don't do this at all. But unfortunately, I won't really have time to go into that. This is how most random state scrambles work these days. And in fact, everything like WCA puzzles or puzzles that people normally do, if we know how to do them random state, we know how to do them this way. So we don't have to use the other approaches. So when you're generating random state scramble, picking a random state is usually pretty simple. Using a program to solve it, that takes some work. Someone has to code the program, but once you've written it, it works. Depending on the puzzle, this can actually take a lot of careful effort. For example, computers were not powerful enough to solve cubes to about 20, 30 move solutions until the mid-90s. And people didn't think for a long time. In fact, I didn't think that web browsers could come up with good solutions. But now they can, and a lot of them are good enough to use, even though they're not quite optimal, they're very close to it. And the last part, inverting, is very simple. So I'll talk about the first two a little. Picking a random state. Well, what exactly is a random state? We said, okay, if you do lots of moves, 25 is not enough, 50 is not enough, 100 is not enough. What does enough mean? So it turns out, if you say, let's just do lots and lots of moves, we're going to keep going 1,000, 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000. After a while, the distribution levels out, and you get a nice distribution. So you could either just do lots of moves until you get to that distribution, or maybe figure out the distribution and then, roll one large die, pick a random number, and figure out which index, like which particular state it corresponds to. Another approach that is fairly intuitive and natural is, let's pretend you've got a puzzle in front of you. You want a random state. So you can take it apart and put it back together. And we all know that doesn't quite work for the cube because you have parity. But let's say you have a standard way to fix parity. You're like, well, if there's two edges, or if there's parity for permutation, you flip the front two corners on the top. Or if there's an odd edge permutation, you flip the front up edge. So you can resolve that, and you get a random permutation. And the nice thing is that for all WCA puzzles, these turn out to be the same definition. Now, this isn't there's an asterisk here, because for square one, there are two ways to define what it means to do lots of random moves, depending on whether turning the top and the bottom counts as one move. Because slice is written as a slash in square one notation, but top and bottom are written inside parentheses. So like 5, 3 would mean turn the top 5, turn the bottom 3 times 30 degrees. So depending on whether you count that as one move or not, those give you different distributions. But if you pick the right one, then that actually matches the distribution for a square one if you assemble it randomly. Now this you also have to do carefully, and the way you do that is you just start at, I don't have a square one, but you start at the slice on the top, and you pick a random piece, and you keep putting them around the top, going clockwise, and you do the same thing on the bottom. And if at any point you place a corner piece over the slice so that it can't turn, you just start over. You throw away where it can start over. Turns out you actually get a random state according to the same as if you'd done lots of random moves, which is completely non-trivial, but I'm happy to talk about it if you want to understand more about why. But this is nice because we have a very simple definition of what random is. There's this what I call Markov random state, if you know about Markov models, and random literal permutation of assembling pieces. Unfortunately, I don't really have got time to go right now into how scrambling programs work. If you've ever been to Jaap's puzzle page, you'll know he has a lot of descriptions of puzzles and how to solve them, but he also has interesting things on cube theory and how cubing programs work. So Jaap's puzzle page at jaapsch.net, jaapsch.net, has a lot of cool details. And also, if you look up Herbert Kosiemba's sites, kosiemba.org, he came up with the 3x3 solution that all fast computer programs use. His website has a good explanation of how his algorithm works. It's a bit technical, but if you search for my name on speedsolving.com, I also have a slightly more simplified explanation of how that works, if you're interested. Is that a question? Okay. So it took a while for us to adopt random state scrambles for WCA competitions, and that was mostly because nobody had written them. Clock was random from the start because if you know how the clock works, there are 14 independent clocks. Each one has a random position from 1 to 12. So you just pick peg orders, do position from 1 to 12 in each one, and you get a random state. And the big change was 3x3. In 2008, we switched to actually Herbert Kosiemba's program, Cube Explorer. He added a feature where you just say, I want 5 random scrambles, and we used that. In 2010, we managed to switch over to a square one in Megaminx. So me and Michael Gottlieb worked on the latter two, and Conrad Ryder adapted something for 2x2. And these worked, they still looked like the thing I showed you from 2004, but now they started using random state for these puzzles. The interesting one is 4x4x4, because 4x4 is actually pretty large, and it took not a lot of thinking, let's say. It took quite some clever code to come up with a 4x4 solver that would produce reasonable length solutions. If you've ever scrambled a 4x4, it's about 40, 50 moves for official scrambles. We used to do, I think, 50 random moves. So it was comparable and practical to use. Yeah? What about 5 through 7? I have another slide on that, but basically, we don't have any good solutions for 5 to 7. We actually still use random moves because it's the best we know. It's reasonably random, and cubers don't really get an advantage out of the part that isn't random. We don't have any solvers that are fast enough to solve the big cubes to produce efficient scrambles. The really cool part was that we could actually do that for 4x4. A guy named Chen Shuang from China, who's really good at coding cube stuff, wrote one in Java, and we ended up using it in Noodle. So, circling back to Noodle, I mentioned in 2004 we had this like weird turquoise interface. Well, we kept the turquoise interface, but what Ron, who's a member of the WCA board, wanted he wanted a single program that could generate scrambles for all events. And so we had these scrambles in the browser, and they were all separate. And I mentioned we used Cube Explorer from Herbert Kosiemba for 3x3. I tried to write a program called Mark II, which is on the left, where you just inputted how many things you wanted from different events, and it would do everything in the browser and display it to you. And Jeremy Fleischman, who's not here today, but he'll be here tomorrow night, he's been around for a while, he wrote a successor to CCT called Noodle, which you could use in the browser. And what we ended up using was the core of his engine. And I sort of put it over my interface, and we joined forces, and we made what's called Noodle, which is now the WCA Scrambler since 2013. So that's what we use. That's how delegates select scrambles for a competition on the right. And I thought I'd add a footnote, which is that technically, according to the regulations, a scrambler is a human. They apply moves. A Scramble program is something that generates the scrambles for them. Also, a scramble is a state, like this is a scramble. But the actual moves that lead to this would be called a scramble sequence. Now in practice, we all say scrambler and scramble, and I don't really care, but it's sort of useful to have the distinction sometimes. So you asked about 5x5 through 7x7. There's one other puzzle that we don't have random state scrambles for, and that's Megaminx. What we have on the left here is what Megaminx used to be. We used to number all 12 sides, so we could use uppercase A through F, that's 6 letters, and then lowercase a through F for the stuff on the back. And you would have to look at which side of those 12 sides it was and do the move, and then look at the next side, and you'd have to scramble a Megaminx like this with literally random moves on all 12 sides. And this is really awkward and slow, and you get it wrong a lot. So Stefan Pachmann, whom I mentioned earlier, came up with an alternative idea. I wish I had a Megaminx on me. Does anyone have a Megaminx? Ah, excellent. So he said, well, sure, Megaminx has a lot of possible states. There's a lot of pieces. They can go into a lot of places independently from each other. So he said, what if we just try to move stuff around as much as possible? So he said, rather than moving individual sides, we'll move the entire puzzle. So I'm going to hold on to the UL edge and then turn the right side of the puzzle either clockwise or counterclockwise. And rather than having 4 possibilities, we'll make it simple. You either go 2 clockwise or 2 counterclockwise. That's a lot of movement. And then you turn the bottom some amount. And you keep going, turning the right and the bottom of the puzzle. And then after a while, you also switch and you do a U-turn so that the UL edge also gets scrambled up. So this does a good job of scrambling the puzzle around. Thank you for Megaminx. I just wanted a short demonstration. This is a good job of scrambling the Megaminx around, and he proved that the centers end up in random positions. We don't really know how truly random it is, but it's good enough for now, and no one's really complained about it. Maybe we'll come up with something better. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem we'll be able to do random state because you would just have to do too many moves in order to actually generate all possible states. Yes? My question was, how long until we generate random states for 5x5 and up? So that was my next slide. Right now we do sufficiently many random moves. We don't know anything else. 5x5 solvers are really hard. If you know about math and about exponential programs, exponential growth, exponential algorithms, the number of moves keeps going up a lot. And then those moves multiply by each other the larger the cube gets. And so 3x3 was just barely practical. 4x4 is like on the edge of we can generate suboptimal solutions but not optimal. Some of the smartest people who made 3x3 and 4x4 solvers happen don't believe we can come up with they don't believe we can come up with an optimal 4x4 or pretty close optimal 5x5 solve. Or if we do, we can just barely manage it. Like maybe we can solve a 4x4 optimally if we take all the resources we took for finding God's number for 3x3. But so far, nobody thinks we'll be able to do this practically unless we come up with something new we haven't thought of or just become really clever with what we already know in a way that we haven't thought of yet. Any question? Are you asking about filtering? Like minimum number of moves? Yeah, something I haven't mentioned yet, which I was going to mention later. In fact, let me just mention this. I was going to mention 5 more things, and one of them was filtering. So I'll get to that later. Yeah, so last things I wanted to mention is WCA scrambling has a few idiosyncrasies, and they took some time to build up. So scrambles, the way they're oriented, the fact that we're saving scrambles and holding on to them after competitions, filtering scrambles so that we don't get scrambles that are too easy, BLD orientation, where we randomize the centers for 3x3 blindfolded, and in fact also 5x5 blindfolded and multi-blind. and fewest moves, scrambles, and scramble sheets. So can you hold your question until the end, or is it relevant to this? Okay, I'll try to go through this quickly because they're sort of like little trivia tidbits. So scramble orientation, we scramble cubes with white on top and green in front. If you don't have those, then you just look for the brightest and the darkest adjacent colors. Does anyone know why we use this orientation? Who liked the color green? Some guy. I heard Tyson Mao. Tyson Mao is correct. Yeah, why do we scramble with green in front, white on top? Because Tyson Mao wrote the regulations, and that was his blindfolded color scheme, and he just needed to pick something. So that's what he used, and that's what we use. So second thing, saving scrambles. We didn't used to save scrambles from competitions. If there was an incident, we didn't necessarily have the scramble that led to it. So it took a bunch of us sort of pushing for it and getting it into the regulations, but now it says that delegates have to use all scramble sequences used in a competition. And a lot of people may not know this because it doesn't show up on the WCA website when you look at a competition and its results. But if you look at the database export, there's something under results there where you can look and download. We actually attach the scrambles there, and some other tools that show WCA results with extra information show these scrambles. And this has been very useful for dealing with incidents where we wanted to make sure that something was scrambled properly, or if it wasn't scrambled properly, what exactly happened? Was there a corner twist during scrambling? Like lots of things that can be answered by this that we didn't have before. Question in the back? I'm told WCADB.net has Scramble competitions.
Or IWCA.jp.
And IWCA.jp. I think I've seen them on IWCA.jp, so that sounds good. And what was the other one again? WCADB.net. Yeah, so check them out if you're curious about scrambles or you want to see yours from this competition after it's over.
Why do we call the Scramble program T-Noodle?
Why do we call the Scramble program T-Noodle? It's an acronym that Jeremy came up with, and nobody really questioned it. I'll have to look it up and get back to you. Or maybe if someone else looks it up, I can mention it later. Okay. There's a place called Thai Noodle, which we used to go to after competitions in Berkeley. And so Thai Noodle, T-Noodle. However, it also has an acronym that it stands for, and that's the thing that I didn't remember, which is basically just a silly acronym in order to make it sound like T-Noodle. So filtering, you asked about earlier. We require at the minimum that every puzzle scrambles have to be at least 2 moves so that you don't get really easy scrambles. This matters, for example, on 2x2 because there are only 3.7 million possible scrambles. Sure, that's kind of a lot, but if you take a scramble that's maybe like 1 out of 1,000 probability, that's if you take the 1 out of 1,000 most likely scrambles, each of those will show up 1 out of 3,000, 4,000 times. You're getting to the point where people will just randomly see them at competitions, and they'll be really, really easy. I'm talking like 2 moves, 3 moves. And so the board was worried that it was going to have to decide at some point, okay, this competition got a 2-move scramble. We can't allow this. So they said, we're just going to send minimum amounts so that we don't have to decide what the filters are. Well, they didn't quite say this. It was discussed, and there was a compromise, and we ended up with this. But roughly, the idea was that no one person, no delegate, not the board, would decide what level we filter at. We just had a standard, and the Scramble program does it, and no one looks at the scrambles and decides what's okay. So this is a little bit larger for other puzzles. They're kind of arbitrarily chosen. There is no good way to pick them other than to say, this looks good enough. So that's what we use. And this has been around since 2014, so it took us a while to actually specify these filters. Programs sometimes had them, Scramble programs sometimes had them, but it wasn't consistent until 2014. BLD orientation is actually also a fairly new one. Back in the day, and in fact still, regulation A2E in solving says that when you're sitting down here and the judge comes up, the judge places the puzzle onto the mat in an arbitrary orientation. What does arbitrary mean? Well, it means anything. So it was written that way so that competitors couldn't complain if they didn't always get like white on top on green in front, or couldn't request the orientation, which is actually possible in 2006 and earlier. So some people would sort of be able to request that they got white on top and green in front, or organizers could manage it so that always happened. Well, in other places, they would randomize the cubes so that the competitor wouldn't predict it. And there was an incident with a competitor in Poland who kept getting scrambles in his desired orientation, whereas other blindfolded competitors around the world didn't. So what the board decided was, okay, we're just going to randomize the centers for blindfolded too. So if you do a blindfolded scramble, there will be wide turns at the end. You will place a random center on top, and then you'll turn the bottom around to place random center in front, and you'll have a random orientation for the centers, and the overall scramble is still random. And now, if anybody, unless somebody specifically puts it back into like white on top, green in front, it's going to be random for the competitor. So it's completely fair. If you have a whole bunch of multi-blind cubes, they'll all be facing different directions, and nobody gets an advantage. And the last one is fewest moves. Very recently, this year, we added random moves at the beginning, at the end. And the reason was that sometimes human solutions would just happen to line up with a scramble, and the regulations said you couldn't do that. So they, not Kevin, who was here earlier, suggested, well, let's do this, because R prime, U prime, F will randomize the edge orientation. So if somebody is doing something like block building or edge orientation, this won't help them, so they won't start with the same moves. So FMC moves are this at the beginning, at the end. And a bit of trivia is that the FMC scramble sheet could have been the thing on the left. It could have been a Scantron form. Arnoud van Gaalen tried it out. He begged me not to go further with that idea. So we have the thing on the right. And we started using them once Noodle became official. Ask me later. Yeah, so if you remember one thing, random state scrambles, they're good. If you're choosing a timer, use random state scrambles. If you're writing a timer, use random state scrambles. There's some programs you can use. Thanks.